A god died in the streets of Baldur's Gate during a celebration as thousands watched while the city tore itself apart into fear and violence and murder as the system survived by becoming worse than the threat it claimed to fight. This archive documents the Founders' Day slaughter and the system which emerged from it. If you have played Baldur's Gate 3, you have walked through a city still carrying the scars of this event, and you have seen the flaming fist guarding the streets they once filled with blood, and you have passed monuments to order built on foundations of mass graves, and you may not have known what happened here, but the city remembers. Even if it pretends to forget, Baldur's Gate believed the crisis was long over, as the city convinced itself the age of murder had passed, and it pointed to one living proof in the form of Abdel Adrian, who had carried the essence of Bhaal for decades, and had fought it, and survived it, and chose to serve the city instead of destroying it, and the people accepted him, and elevated him, and used him as proof. Blood did not decide fate, and even those born from murder could choose order. Abdel Adrian had been a hero once, and he had saved the city from his own half-brother who tried to claim the throne of murder, and he had fought through conspiracies and betrayals, and had emerged victorious, and had refused the dark power offered to him, and had instead dedicated his life to protecting the people he could have destroyed, as the city rewarded him with a seat on the ruling council, and eventually with the title of Grand Duke, and he wore this title for years while he ruled well and gave the people hope. This story was not entirely false, as Abdel Adrian genuinely tried to be good, and he genuinely served the city, and he genuinely believed he had escaped his father's shadow. And yet the deeper lie remained because Bhaal himself was gone, and the threat had passed, and the city could simply move forward as if nothing had happened. The truth was more complicated, and the truth was dangerous because Bhaal had designed his children as vessels for his resurrection, and every child of Bhaal who died released their fragment of divine essence, and eventually enough essence would gather to restore the god, and the only question was when and how many would die before it happened. The cult of Bhaal had not disappeared when their god fell silent, and they had gone underground and waited and rebuilt their networks in the shadows of a city which refused to believe they still existed. The cult understood something the city did not, as they understood their god was patient, and they understood their god was inevitable, and they understood every murder fed the system, and every death brought the restoration closer, and they did not need to win any single battle because time itself was their ally. In the months before Founders' Day, the signs were everywhere as murders following ritual patterns appeared in the lower city, and bodies were found arranged in ways suggesting religious purpose, while dockworkers whispered about new gangs with strange initiation requirements, and the Flaming Fist investigated some of these killings and did not connect them, and did not recognize the pattern, and did not want to recognize the pattern. The investigators who looked too closely were reassigned, while the reports which drew uncomfortable conclusions were buried, and the officers who insisted on pursuing cult connections found their careers suddenly stalled as the system protected itself from information it did not want to process. The cult had infiltrated the city at every level as they placed members among the dockworkers who controlled the harbor, and they recruited from the street gangs who knew every alley and escape route, and they penetrated minor guild offices where paperwork could be altered and shipments could be misdirected, and all of this infrastructure was already in place long before the attack. The outer city proved particularly fertile ground for recruitment as the people who lived beyond the walls received no protection from the Flaming Fist, and they received no representation in the council, and they received nothing from the system except contempt, and when the cult offered them belonging and purpose and the promise of power, they listened. Founders' Day was the perfect target, as it represented everything the cult wanted to destroy, in a single concentrated moment with maximum civilian density combined with maximum symbolic exposure, and the Grand Duke himself would stand before the people and speak of unity and continuity, while surrounded by citizens who believed they were celebrating their safety but were actually gathering for a slaughter. The festival celebrated the founding of the city, and it celebrated the walls which protected it, and it celebrated the institutions which governed it, and it celebrated the illusion of stability which the ruling class had spent generations constructing, while the cult intended to tear down that illusion in a single afternoon. The attack came from a man named Viakang, who was himself a child of Bhaal, and who had survived the decades since the original crisis by hiding and running and never staying in one place long enough to be found, until something changed inside him and something broke, and he came to Baldur's Gate on Founders Day with murder in his heart and transformation in his blood. Vikang had spent years fleeing from what he was as he watched other children of Bhaal die one by one, and he felt each death as a pull towards something he did not want to become. And he resisted, and he hid, until eventually the weight of all those accumulated deaths became too heavy and the voice of his father became too loud, and he stopped running and started hunting. Vikang confronted Abdel Adrian in full public view before the assembled crowds who had come to celebrate their city and their duke, and then Vikang transformed into the Slayer, which was the monstrous avatar form of Bhaal himself, and the thing every child of Bhaal carried inside them as both gift and curse, while the people watched in horror as this creature of nightmare erupted in the middle of their festival. The Slayer was an instrument of divine murder, as its claws could tear through armor, and its speed was beyond human comprehension, and its hunger for death was bottomless, while the people who stood closest to the transformation died instantly, and their blood sprayed across the cobblestones as the screaming began. Abdel Adrian fought back as the battle between two children of Bhaal tore through the celebration, while civilians fled and screamed and trampled each other in their desperation to escape. And when the violence finally ended, both lay dead, and the divine essence, which had been scattered across hundreds of children for generations, was finally released and gathered as Bhaal, the Lord of Murder, began his return to full divine power. The plaza where they fell became a crater of blood as the bodies of the innocent lay scattered around it, while the survivors who had witnessed the transformation stood frozen in shock, and the silence which followed the violence was worse than the screaming, because in that silence, everyone understood something fundamental had changed. The people did not understand what they had witnessed, as what they saw was their beloved Grand Duke transforming into a monster in his final moments and dying as the thing he had always secretly been, while every story they had told themselves about redemption and heroism collapsed in an instant, and the Duke they had trusted was revealed as something inhuman, and everything felt like a lie. If Abdel Adrian could hide his true nature for decades, then anyone could be hiding anything, and the neighbor who seemed friendly might be a cultist, and the merchant who sold you bread might be planning your murder, and the soldier who claimed to protect you might be waiting for the signal to transform as trust itself became impossible. The riots began within hours as fear spread faster than any official response could contain it, while the violence which followed was civilian terror turning inward, and neighbors accused neighbors of being secret cultists, and families turned on family members who had shown any sign of unusual behavior, and strangers were beaten in the streets for looking suspicious as the city consumed itself in a frenzy of paranoid violence, which killed far more people than the original attack ever could. Rumors spread as people whispered Bhaal had returned, and children of Bhaal were hidden throughout the city waiting to transform, and the cult had infiltrated every institution and every guild and every neighborhood, and none of these rumors were entirely false, while the truth was far more dangerous than hidden monsters, because the real threat was what ordinary people would do to each other when they believed monsters were everywhere. The Flaming Fist mobilized to restore order as their methods made everything worse, because they had no way to identify actual cultists and no way to separate genuine threats from terrified civilians, and so they treated everyone as a potential enemy, and they sealed districts and imposed curfews and arrested anyone who resisted, and they beat confessions out of people who had nothing to confess, and they killed people in the streets and called it maintaining order. The ruling council fractured under the pressure as the Grand Duke was dead, while the remaining members could not agree on how to respond, and emergency powers were enacted without full consensus, and several council members found themselves sidelined or overruled, as the decisions which shaped the city's response were made by whoever could seize authority in the chaos rather than through any legitimate process. The criminal organization known as the Guild became a convenient scapegoat because they were already criminals, and already organized and already feared, and blaming them for the violence allowed the authorities to claim progress while avoiding the harder question of cult infiltration. And so, the Flaming Fist rounded up guild members and guild associates, and people who had once known guild members, and people who looked like they might be criminals, and they threw them into cells, and they extracted confessions, and they executed people without evidence, and they called this justice. This misdirection served the actual cult perfectly, as while the Fist was busy hunting criminals, the real Bhaal worshippers remained hidden and continued their work, and every false arrest and every wrongful execution strengthened the fear and chaos the cult needed to complete their god's return. The tribunals which followed the initial violence abandoned any pretense of proper legal process, as speed was valued over accuracy and confessions were valued over evidence, while the people running these tribunals knew most of their victims were probably innocent, and they also knew the public needed to see people punished, and so they provided punishment regardless of guilt. Detainees disappeared into Flaming Fist custody and never emerged, as their families were told they had resisted arrest or attempted escape or attacked their guards, while the bodies were disposed of without ceremony and the records were sealed, and anyone who asked too many questions found themselves under suspicion as potential cult sympathizers. The purges expanded beyond suspected cultists to include anyone who had become inconvenient, as the chaos provided cover for settling old scores and removing political obstacles and silencing witnesses to previous crimes, while powerful people used the crisis to eliminate rivals while claiming they were protecting the city from hidden threats. Entire neighborhoods were quietly cleared as the Fist moved through the lower city and the outer city, and they arrested and detained, and sometimes simply killed anyone who could not prove their innocence to the satisfaction of soldiers who had already decided they were guilty, while the people who lived in these neighborhoods had no recourse and no appeal and no one who would speak for them. The violence eventually subsided through exhaustion as the city ran out of convenient targets and the fear burned itself out, and people grew too tired to keep killing each other, while the institutions which had perpetrated the worst abuses simply declared victory and moved on. What emerged from the ashes was a hardened city, as emergency powers had become normalized, and the Flaming Fist had proven it could do whatever it wanted during a crisis, while the ruling council had learned legitimacy mattered less than control, and the population had learned to keep their heads down and their suspicions private. A new Grand Duke eventually emerged from the chaos, and his name was Ravengard, and he was a Flaming Fist commander who had distinguished himself during the crisis, and he represented exactly what the city had become, as he was a military man who believed in order above all else, and he carried the lessons of the Founders' Day slaughter into his governance, and those lessons were simple and brutal and effective. Public discussion of the Founders' Day slaughter diminished rapidly as the authorities made clear dwelling on the past was unhealthy, and proper citizens looked forward rather than backward, while the commemorations which followed in subsequent years carefully avoided mentioning the massacre or the riots or the purges, and instead focused on renewal and resilience and other words which meant forgetting. The historical record was actively managed, as documents were sealed and altered, and sometimes simply destroyed, while witnesses were encouraged to remember events differently, and anyone who tried to investigate too deeply found their access restricted and their questions unanswered. And eventually most people simply accepted the official version, because accepting it was easier than fighting it. The return of Bhaal was never publicly acknowledged, because admitting the god of murder had reconstituted himself from the death of his children would mean admitting the entire crisis had been pointless, and all the violence and all the purges and all the innocent people who died had accomplished nothing except feeding the very god they were trying to stop. The Flaming Fist emerged from the crisis stronger than before, as they had proven their necessity, and they had demonstrated what happened to cities which did not maintain sufficient force, and they had shown they would do whatever was required to maintain order, regardless of law or morality, or the lives of the people they claimed to protect. The cult of Bhaal had achieved something remarkable through the massacre, and they had proven the city's stability was an illusion, and fear could transform ordinary citizens into murderers, and the institutions meant to protect people would instead become instruments of terror when properly provoked, and all of this fed their god, and all of this validated everything they believed. The survivors learned to live with what they had done and what had been done to them, as they simply stopped talking about it, and stopped thinking about it, and stopped acknowledging anything had fundamentally changed. Even though everything had changed, while the city which existed after Founders' Day was not the same city which had existed before, even if it wore the same name and occupied the same streets and pretended to be the same place. This is the pattern which defines Baldur's Gate and which explains why the city persists despite crisis after crisis, as the systems which govern it are not designed to prevent disaster, but to survive disaster and to emerge from disaster with more power and less accountability. While the people who run those systems understand catastrophe is not a threat to their authority, but an opportunity to expand it. The Founders' Day slaughter was a revelation of what the city had always been beneath its celebrations and its monuments and its stories about heroic Grand Dukes who overcame their dark heritage. And when the pressure came, the city did not rise to meet it with justice or wisdom, but collapsed into exactly the violence and fear and institutional murder its systems were designed to enable. If you have played Baldur's Gate 3, you have met Duke Ravengard, and you have seen what the Flaming Fist became under his command, and you have witnessed a city still living in the shadow of events it refuses to name. And you have walked through streets where the blood has long since washed away, but the stains remain in the institutions and the policies and the reflexive fear which grips the population whenever something threatens the fragile order. There are no heroes in this record. As heroism implies, someone stopped the horror and no one stopped it, while heroism implies justice was eventually served, and justice was never served, while heroism implies the victims were remembered and honored, and the victims were forgotten as quickly as the city could manage to forget them. There is only the system as the system continues, and the system does not care how many people it destroys in the process of continuing while the system exists to preserve itself, and it preserved itself through the Founders' Day slaughter, and it will preserve itself through whatever comes next, regardless of the cost. The people who died in the riots were fuel, and the people who died in the purges were waste products, and the people who survived learned their survival depended on accepting this, and on never questioning it, and on teaching their children to accept it as well. Baldur's Gate still stands as the Flaming Fist still patrols its streets, and the council still governs from the High Hall, and the harbour still fills with ships, and the markets still bustle with trade, and none of this means the city recovered, because recovery implies healing, and healing implies acknowledging the wound, and the city has never acknowledged what it did to itself during those terrible days. The wound remains open beneath the surface as it festers quietly, and it waits for the next crisis to tear it open again, while the conditions which created the Founders' Day slaughter have not been addressed, and the cult infrastructure which enabled it was never fully dismantled, and the institutional capacity for mass violence was not reformed, but rewarded. Bhaal walks the mortal plane once more as he is diminished from his former glory, but still divine and still hungry, and still fed by every murder committed in his name, and every murder committed by those who fear his name, while the city, which thought it had escaped him, learned escape was never possible, and the god of murder does not forget and does not forgive and does not stop. This archive contains no lessons, as lessons imply something could have been done differently, and perhaps it could have, while the people who could have done it differently chose not to, and the systems which could have prevented the horror instead enabled it, and everyone who had the power to stop what happened decided stopping it was less important than protecting their own position. There is only record, as the record shows Baldur's Gate survived the Founders' Day slaughter through violence and forgetting, and the willingness to sacrifice however many people needed to be sacrificed to maintain the illusion. Everything was fine. The Grand Duke is dead and long forgotten, as the people who killed each other in the streets are dead and forgotten, while the people who were purged in the aftermath are dead and forgotten. And the only thing which remains is the system which killed them. And the system does not remember, and the system does not need to remember. And the system simply continues. There is only record.